Michael Chen was the kind of guy who always played it safe. He wore his seatbelt before the car even started moving. He checked his mirrors 3 times before changing lanes. He never ever touched his phone while driving. At 32, he'd built a quiet life as a high school math teacher, and honestly, he loved it. His students thought he was cool because he could make algebra seem less terrifying. He ran the chess club after school. His small apartment was surprisingly organized for a single guy. Everything in his life had a place, a routine, a sense of order that made him feel secure. That Tuesday in November started like every other Tuesday. Michael stayed late after school, helping one of his students understand quadratic equations. The kid was really struggling, and Michael didn't mind staying an extra hour. That's just who he was. By the time he packed up his papers and headed to his car, the sun had already gone down. A light rain was falling, the kind that makes the roads just slick enough to be dangerous but doesn't feel serious enough to worry about. He turned on his windshield wipers and started the drive home. His mind was already thinking ahead to the evening. There was leftover pizza in the fridge. Maybe he'd watch something on Netflix, or maybe he'd finally start grading those tests he'd been putting off. Just normal thoughts. Normal plans. The kind of boring everyday stuff that makes up a regular life. The intersection near his apartment was one he'd crossed probably 5,000 times. There was nothing special about it. A traffic light, a convenience store, a gas station, just another corner in the city. His light turned green. Michael glanced left, then right, just out of habit. Everything looked clear. He pressed the gas pedal and started through the intersection. He never saw it coming. 1 second, Michael was thinking about pizza. The next second, there was an explosion of sound so loud it seemed to erase the entire world. Metal screaming. Glass exploding into 1,000 pieces. His car spinning like a toy in the hands of an angry child. He felt himself thrown against the seatbelt, his head snapping to the side hard enough that he wondered if his neck had broken. The airbag exploded into his face with a force he'd never imagined, and then everything went into this weird slow motion, like he was watching a movie of his own life. His car spun once, twice, maybe 3 times, he couldn't tell. The world outside became nothing but streaks of light and rain and darkness all mixed together. He tried to brake, but his foot wouldn't respond. His brain was sending signals, but his body wasn't listening. Then came the second impact. His car slammed into something solid. A light pole, maybe, or a building. He'd never be sure, but finally, mercifully, the car stopped moving. For a few heartbeats, there was complete silence. Michael sat there in his destroyed car, trying to understand what had just happened. Steam or smoke was rising from his hood. He could hear rain patting against what was left of his roof. The driver's side door was crushed inward, pressing against his left arm. The windshield looked like a spider had built the world's most complicated web across it. Then the pain arrived. It started in his lower back, this burning sensation that spread up his spine like someone had poured gasoline on his bones and lit a match. He tried to move his legs. Nothing happened. He tried again, putting all his focus into just wiggling his toes. Still nothing. That's when the fear hit him cold and sharp. Michael had seen enough medical shows to know that losing feeling in your legs after a car accident was about the worst sign possible. He opened his mouth to yell for help, but only a weak wheeze came out. Something was wrong with his breathing, too. Each breath felt shallow, incomplete, like he was only using half of his lungs. The pain in his back was getting worse with every second, spreading out in waves that made him want to scream. But he couldn't scream. He could barely breathe. Michael heard footsteps running toward his car. Voices shouting. Someone was on their phone calling 911. A face appeared at his window, a young guy with terrified eyes. He looked barely 20, probably a college student. "Hey man, hang on. Ambulance is coming. Can you hear me?" Michael tried to nod, but even that tiny movement sent lightning bolts of agony shooting through his neck and spine. He made a small sound, something between a groan and a whimper. The guy seemed to understand. "Don't move, okay? Just stay really still. Help is coming." Time became strange after that. Michael would later have no memory of how long he sat in that destroyed car. Could have been 5 minutes. Could have been an hour. His brain kept trying to float away from his body, like it wanted to escape the pain. He'd snap back to awareness when someone spoke to him, or when a new wave of pain rolled through. But then he'd start drifting again, floating somewhere between conscious and unconscious. The sound of sirens pulled him back to reality. Red and blue lights painted the inside of his car, flashing across the broken glass and twisted metal. More voices now, calm and professional. Firefighters appeared, wearing heavy jackets and carrying big metal tools. They talked to him in steady, reassuring voices, explaining exactly what they were doing. They were going to cut him out of the car, they said. He just needed to stay calm and let them work. Michael heard the sound of metal being cut. The smell of something burning filled his nose. Someone had their hand on his shoulder, a gentle but firm pressure, a reminder that he wasn't alone. A woman's voice kept asking him questions. "What's your name? How old are you? What day is it?" Michael tried to answer, but his words came out slurred and quiet like he was drunk. "Possible spinal injury," he heard someone say. Those 3 words cut through the fog in his brain like a knife. Spinal injury. That meant paralysis, wheelchair, never walking again. His whole life, everything he'd planned, everything he'd taken for granted, suddenly felt like it was slipping away. When they finally got him out of the car and onto a stretcher, the movement made him cry out. The pain was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once, a fire that consumed everything else. Someone put an oxygen mask over his face. He felt the prick of an IV needle in his arm. The stretcher was loaded into an ambulance, and suddenly they were moving, sirens wailing. The female paramedic who'd been asking him questions was in the back with him. She had short brown hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Her name tag said Lisa. She kept checking monitors and adjusting things on his IV, all while talking to him in a calm, steady voice. "Michael, right? I'm Lisa. You're doing great, okay? We're taking you to County General Hospital. It's about 10 minutes away. I need you to stay with me, Michael. Keep your eyes open. Tell me about your job. You teach math, right? That's what your ID says." Michael tried to focus on her voice, tried to answer her questions about school and his students, but the pain was too much. Everything was starting to fade. The edges of his vision were going dark, like someone was slowly turning off the lights. He felt himself slipping away, and honestly, part of him wanted to just let go. It would be so much easier to just stop fighting, to just drift off into that peaceful darkness. "Michael, eyes on me, stay with me." Lisa's voice was sharp now, urgent. She was doing something with the IV, calling out numbers to the driver. The ambulance sped up. Michael managed to focus on her face one more time. She looked worried. Really worried. If an experienced paramedic was worried, that meant things were bad. Really bad. That thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt strangely calm, almost peaceful. The ambulance doors burst open. Bright lights flooded in, so bright they hurt his eyes. More people in scrubs surrounded his stretcher. They were running now, pushing him fast through hallways. The ceiling lights streaked past overhead like shooting stars. Someone was shouting medical terms he didn't understand. Words like stat and OR and pressure. Dropping. The urgency in their voices told him everything he needed to know about how serious this was. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in a window as they rushed past. His face was pale, almost gray. Small cuts from the glass covered his cheeks. Blood stained his shirt. He looked like a stranger. He looked like someone who might not make it. The last thing Michael remembered before the world went black was thinking about his students. Tomorrow was Wednesday. He had a quiz scheduled on polynomials. Someone would need to cover his class. He hoped whoever took over would be patient with Danny, the kid who tried so hard but really struggled with numbers. Danny needed encouragement, not pressure. He needed someone to believe in him. And then the darkness swallowed Michael completely, pulling him down into a void where there was no pain, no fear, no thought. Just nothing. The operating room was chaos, though Michael knew nothing about it. He was somewhere far away, lost in a darkness that felt both terrifying and strangely peaceful. While he floated in that void between life and something else, Dr. Morrison and her surgical team fought to keep him alive. 7 hours. That's how long they worked on him. 7 hours of careful, precise work, cutting, repairing, stitching. His spine had fractured at the L1 vertebra, a critical spot where even millimeters mattered. 3 ribs were broken, and one of them had punctured his lung, causing it to partially collapse. There was internal bleeding in his abdomen that required delicate work to find and stop. Every few minutes, someone would call out his blood pressure or heart rate, and the entire team would adjust based on those numbers. Dr. Morrison was a trauma surgeon with 15 years of experience. She'd seen hundreds of car accidents. She'd treated falls from buildings, industrial injuries, all kinds of terrible things. But something about this case got to her. Maybe it was because Michael reminded her of her younger brother, who was also a teacher. Maybe it was because his wallet had fallen out during the rescue, and she'd seen his driver's license, his library card, a photo of him on top of a mountain somewhere with the biggest grin on his face. In that photo, he looked so alive, so full of joy and possibility. She was determined to give him a chance to feel that way again. When Michael finally started waking up in the recovery room, everything was confused. His mind felt foggy, thick, like he was trying to think through layers of cotton. He couldn't remember his own name at first. Couldn't remember where he was or why. His throat hurt terribly. There was something in his throat, he realized with sudden panic. A tube. He couldn't talk, couldn't swallow properly, couldn't breathe on his own. The panic rose in his chest and immediately machines started beeping loudly. A nurse appeared, her face swimming into focus above him. She had gentle hands and a soft voice. "Michael, you're okay. You're in the hospital. You were in a bad accident. You had surgery. That tube is helping you breathe right now. Don't fight it. Just try to relax and breathe normally." But how could he relax? If he couldn't breathe on his own, what else was wrong with him? He tried to lift his head to look at his body, but he couldn't move. Something was holding his head and neck completely still. Some kind of brace. The nurse seemed to read his mind. "You're wearing a neck brace. Your spine was injured in the crash. The doctors had to operate to stabilize it. You need to stay very still while everything heals, okay?" His spine. The words from the accident scene came rushing back to him. Spinal injury, his legs. Could he move his legs? Michael tried with everything he had to wiggle his toes, to bend his knees, to feel anything below his waist. There was something there, but it wasn't normal. It felt distant, disconnected, like his legs belonged to someone else entirely. The next few days were a blur. Michael drifted in and out of consciousness. The breathing tube eventually came out, which was both a relief and its own form of torture. His throat felt raw and damaged. Every breath was work. The pain medication helped with the worst of it, but it also made him confused and sleepy. He'd lose entire chunks of time, not sure if his eyes had been closed for 5 minutes or 5 hours. His parents came. His mother tried so hard not to cry when she first saw him, but he could hear her quiet sobs anyway. His father stood at the foot of the bed looking older and more tired than Michael had ever seen him. They held his hands. They told him everything would be fine. They said all the things parents are supposed to say. Michael wanted to believe them, but he could see the fear in their eyes. Dr. Morrison came to talk to him on the 3rd day after surgery. She pulled up a chair and sat down, and Michael appreciated that she didn't try to sugarcoat things or give him false hope. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," she started. "We repaired the fracture in your spine and stopped all the internal bleeding. Your lung is healing nicely. But Michael, I need to be honest with you about the spinal cord injury." "My legs," Michael whispered. His voice was hoarse and broken, but he needed to know. "Right now you have very limited sensation and movement below your waist. We've stabilized everything structurally, but the spinal cord was compressed and bruised during the accident. There's no way to predict exactly how much function you'll regain. Will I walk again?" The question hung in the air between them. Dr. Morrison took a breath. "With intensive physical therapy, there's a possibility you could regain some function. But I want to be completely honest with you. Based on the imaging and the extent of the injury, the likelihood of you walking normally again is less than 30%. 30%. Michael let those words sink in. He'd spent his entire career teaching probability to kids. A 30% chance meant there was a 70% chance he'd spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. 70% chance he'd never hike again, never stand in front of a classroom, never do any of the 1,000 small things he'd always taken for granted. After Dr. Morrison left, Michael just stared at the ceiling. He started counting the tiles. 42 tiles in his room. He counted them again to make sure. Still 42. He wondered if this was his life now, counting ceiling tiles because he had nothing else to do. His students sent cards and letters. His entire classroom had worked together to make him a giant poster board, covered in messages and drawings. "Get well soon, Mr. Chen. We miss you. Math class isn't the same without you." One student had drawn a stick figure of him with a superhero cape. His principal sent flowers. His fellow teachers called to check on him. Everyone was so kind, so hopeful, so convinced he'd bounce back. But Michael wasn't convinced of anything anymore. How could they understand? They could all walk. They could all stand up and go to the bathroom without help. They took their bodies for granted because their bodies had never betrayed them. 2 weeks after the surgery, the physical therapists came to his room for the first time. There were 2 of them, both way too cheerful for 8 in the morning. They brought equipment and far too much enthusiasm. They wanted him to try sitting up. Just sitting up, they said, like it was the easiest thing in the world. It wasn't easy. It was agony. Every muscle in his core screamed in protest. His back felt like it might literally break apart. The room spun so badly he thought he might throw up. He made it to about 45 degrees before he had to stop gasping and shaking like he'd just run a marathon. "That's excellent," one of the therapists said with a huge smile. "Really, really good for your first attempt." Michael wanted to scream at her. How was this excellent? He couldn't even sit up without feeling like he was dying. But they came back the next day. And the day after that. And every day after that. Each session was torture. They'd make him do these tiny movements that should have been effortless but left him exhausted and trembling. "Lift your leg. Just an inch, good. Now the other one. Try to point your toe. Can you feel this? What about this pressure? How about now?" The worst part was how unpredictable his body had become. Sometimes he could feel them touching his legs. Sometimes he couldn't feel anything at all. Sometimes his right foot would move when he concentrated really hard on it. Sometimes nothing would happen no matter how hard he tried. His body had become a stranger to him, unreliable and confusing. Michael stopped talking much when people visited. His friends would come by with stories about work, about their weekends, about their normal lives. He'd nod and make the right sounds, but inside he felt completely disconnected from their world. They could walk out of this hospital room and go hiking or dancing or just to the grocery store. They took it all for granted because they'd never had it stolen from them in a single moment. At night, when the hospital was quiet and dark, Michael would lie awake replaying the accident in his head. If he'd left school just 5 minutes earlier or later, he would have missed that intersection at that exact moment. If he'd stopped for gas, if he'd taken a different route home, if the other driver had looked up from their phone 1 second earlier. 1,000 tiny variables, and any one of them would have changed everything. 6 weeks after the accident, Dr. Morrison had another serious conversation with him. His progress had been minimal. The swelling in his spinal cord had gone down, which was positive. But the damaged nerves weren't healing the way they'd hoped. She used phrases like reaching a plateau and long-term disability planning and quality of life adjustments. She was preparing him for the possibility that this might be as good as it gets. That night, lying alone in his hospital room, Michael made a decision. He was done fighting, done with physical therapy sessions that left him in tears, done with false hope, done with people telling him to stay positive when his entire world had been destroyed. He'd go through whatever motions the hospital required, but he wouldn't really try anymore. What was the point of trying when trying only led to more disappointment? Around midnight, a nurse came in to check his vitals. Michael had seen her a few times before on night shifts, but he'd never really paid attention. Her name tag said Grace. She was older, probably in her 50s, with silver streaks running through her dark hair and deep lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled often. She didn't smile that night, though. She just quietly checked his monitors, wrote something on his chart, adjusted his pillows to make him more comfortable, and prepared to leave. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Long night?" she asked softly. Michael didn't answer. He just kept staring at those 42 ceiling tiles that had become his entire world. Grace nodded like she understood perfectly and left the room without another word. Michael figured that was the end of it. Just another nurse doing her job. But he was wrong. That quiet moment was actually the beginning of something that would change everything about how he saw his situation, his future, and his life. He just didn't know it yet. The change was coming. It would arrive in whispered words that would shake him to his core and give him a reason to fight when he'd completely given up. But that night he knew none of that. That night, he just lay there in the dark, counting ceiling tiles and wondering if this was all his life would ever be again. Part 3. Grace came back the next night, and the night after that. Michael's regular nurse, a guy named Tom, had called in sick for several shifts, and Grace had picked up the extra hours. At first, Michael barely noticed her. She'd come in every few hours to check his vitals, give him medication, help him shift position in bed to prevent bed sores. Just the normal nursing routine that had become background noise to his existence. But Grace was different from the other nurses in a way Michael couldn't quite put his finger on. She didn't force cheerful conversation. She didn't hit him with toxic positivity about how everything happens for a reason, or how he just needed to keep his chin up. She didn't tell him inspiring stories about other patients who'd overcome the odds. She just did her job quietly and competently, occasionally mentioning small observations about nothing particularly important. "Rain tonight," she'd say while adjusting his IV. "That's good. My tomatoes have been really struggling this year. They need the water." Or, "My grandson started kindergarten this week. Cried the whole first day, but by day 3 he didn't want to come home." Funny how kids adapt to things. Michael never responded to these little comments, but Grace didn't seem bothered by his silence. She just kept talking in that calm, easy way, like she was having a quiet conversation with herself and he just happened to be in the room. There was something comforting about it, about her not demanding responses or reactions from him. On her 3rd night of caring for him, something happened that changed their relationship. Michael woke up suddenly around 2 in the morning, his heart racing, his whole body covered in cold sweat. He'd been having the nightmare again, the same one that came almost every night now. In the dream, he could see the other car coming toward him. He could see it clearly, heading straight for his driver's side door. But his body wouldn't move. His foot wouldn't press the brake. His hands wouldn't turn the wheel. He just sat there, frozen and helpless, watching death approach in slow motion. The machines beside his bed started beeping frantically as his heart rate spiked. Grace appeared almost immediately. She moved quickly, but not in a panicked way, checking the monitors first with practiced efficiency, her eyes scanning the numbers. "Bad dream?" she asked quietly, already knowing the answer. Michael nodded, still trying to catch his breath. His chest felt tight. His hands were trembling. The fear from the dream was still clinging to him, making it hard to separate what was real from what wasn't. Grace didn't call for a doctor or rush to give him sedatives. She just pulled up the chair beside his bed and sat down. She adjusted his pillows so he could breathe easier and brought him a cup of water with a straw, helping him take small sips. "Breathe with me," she said calmly. "In through your nose, nice and slow. Out through your mouth. That's it, slow and steady." They breathed together in the dim room until Michael's heart rate came back down to normal. The beeping of the machine slowed to a steady, calming rhythm. His hands stopped shaking. The fear gradually loosened its grip on his chest. Grace stayed in the chair. She didn't pull out her phone to check messages or rush off to see other patients. She just sat there, a calm presence in the darkness like she had all the time in the world. After his breathing was completely normal again, she started talking. Not really to him exactly, just talking. "My husband was in an accident," she said quietly, looking at her hands. "This was about 20 years ago now. He worked construction, was up on a high-rise building downtown. Part of the scaffolding gave way. He fell 3 stories onto concrete." Michael turned his head slightly to look at her. This was the first time Grace had shared anything truly personal. She'd mentioned her grandson, her garden, little everyday things, but never anything like this. "He lived," Grace continued, her voice soft but steady. "But he had a serious traumatic brain injury. For weeks, we didn't know if he'd even wake up. The doctors kept using words like if and maybe and we'll have to wait and see. And then when he finally did wake up, we didn't know if he'd really be him anymore." "You know what I mean?" She paused for a moment, lost in the memory. "The man who eventually came home from the hospital was different. He forgot things all the time. Simple things that shouldn't be hard, like where we kept the coffee or what year our daughter was born. He'd get angry suddenly over nothing at all. He'd look at me sometimes with this confused expression, like he wasn't quite sure who I was or why I was there." Michael found himself genuinely interested in her story, pulled out of his own misery for the first time in weeks. "The doctor said his brain was trying to rewire itself," Grace explained, "creating new pathways around all the damaged areas. They said it could take months or even years. They said he might never be exactly like he was before the accident." She smiled sadly, her eyes distant. They were right about that. He never was the same person he'd been. But slowly, over time, he became someone new. Someone different but still whole in his own way. "Did he get better?" Michael asked, his voice still rough from not using it much. "Better is complicated," Grace said thoughtfully. "He wasn't the same. But he was still here, still alive, still my husband. Still a father to our kids, even if he had to relearn how to be a parent in a lot of ways. He learned to work with his new limitations. He found new things to care about. new ways to find happiness that he'd never considered before. She stood up and checked his monitors one more time, her movements practiced and efficient. He used to tell me something that I didn't really understand for a long time. He'd say the accident took away who he was, but it also showed him who he could become. I thought that was just something he said to make us feel better. But now, after all these years, I finally understand what he meant. Grace moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. Get some rest, Michael. Morning will be here before you know it. After she left, Michael lay there in the darkness thinking about her words. He'd been so completely focused on everything he'd lost that he hadn't even considered that there might be something else waiting on the other side. Not the same as before, obviously, but maybe still something worth fighting for. Over the next couple of weeks, Grace worked several more night shifts. Michael found himself actually looking forward to seeing her. She'd tell him stories about her garden, about her grandchildren and their funny sayings, about the stray cat that had decided to adopt her family. Simple, ordinary stories about everyday life that somehow made him feel connected to the world outside his hospital room. She also told him more about her husband, David, how they'd met in high school at a football game, how he used to bring her flowers every Friday without fail, how after his accident he'd had to relearn so many basic things, how to drive, how to manage their household budget, how to control his temper when his damaged brain made him frustrated. She talked about the setbacks and the bad days, but also about the progress and the good days, about how they'd learned to celebrate tiny victories. Something about her stories gave Michael a different perspective. He started putting slightly more effort into his physical therapy sessions. Not with real hope exactly, more like curiosity. What if Grace was right? What if there was a version of himself waiting on the other side of this that was different, but still worth becoming? The progress was still painfully, frustratingly slow. 3 months after the accident, he felt a definite tingling sensation in his left foot. It wasn't much, just a faint feeling, but it was something. His physical therapist got genuinely excited. Even Dr. Morrison seemed cautiously optimistic for the first time in weeks. But then Michael had a major setback. During a therapy session, he pushed himself too hard trying to prove he could do more. Something in his lower back seized up violently. The pain was absolutely excruciating, worse than anything since the surgery. They had to wheel him back to his room immediately, increase his pain medication significantly, and cancel all therapy sessions for almost a week. That night, lying in bed feeling utterly defeated, Michael made another decision. He was done. Completely done. He couldn't keep riding this exhausting cycle of tiny hope, followed by crushing disappointment. It was too much. Too painful, physically and emotionally. Better to just accept that this broken, limited version of himself was all he'd ever be. Better to stop torturing himself with therapy that clearly wasn't working anyway. When Dr. Morrison came by the next morning, he told her flat out that he wanted to stop all physical therapy. He wanted to transfer to a long-term care facility where he could just exist without the constant pressure to improve. She tried to change his mind, told him it was too soon to give up, that setbacks were normal. But Michael had made up his mind. He felt oddly calm about it, actually. The decision brought a strange sense of relief. Dr. Morrison finally agreed to give him 24 hours to think it over before making it official. She left his room looking worried and sad, and Michael felt his relief deepen. Soon he could stop fighting and just be, whatever that looked like. That night, Grace was back on shift. She came in for his 10 o'clock check-in, and Michael told her about his decision. He explained it calmly, logically, why continuing therapy didn't make sense. Why accepting his limitations was actually the smart, realistic thing to do. Why fighting was just prolonging the inevitable. Grace listened without interrupting, her face neutral. She finished checking his vitals, made some notes on his chart, adjusted his blankets. Then she picked up her tablet and headed for the door like she always did. Michael thought that was it. Just another night, another shift. But at the doorway, Grace stopped walking. She stood there for a long moment with her back to him, completely still. Then she turned around and walked back to his bedside with a purpose in her step he'd never seen before. She leaned over him, bringing her face close to his, close enough that he could see every line etched around her eyes, every fleck of gold in her brown eyes. And then she whispered something that would change everything. Part 4. Grace's face was just inches from Michael's. In all the weeks she'd been taking care of him, he'd never seen her look so intense. There was something burning in her eyes, a mixture of deep sadness and fierce determination that made him hold his breath. "Michael," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with emotion. I need to tell you something important. Something true. My husband's name was David. Past tense. Was. He died 2 years ago. Michael felt his chest tighten. She'd always talked about David's accident in the past tense, but he'd just assumed the man was still alive somewhere. He'd pictured them together, maybe retired, playing with their grandchildren, enjoying their golden years after all they'd been through. Grace continued, her words coming slowly and deliberately. After everything he survived, after the fall and the brain injury and all those years of recovery and struggle and fighting his way back to some kind of normal life, he died from a massive heart attack. It was completely sudden, totally unexpected. He was just gone. In an instant. She straightened up slightly but kept her eyes locked on Michael's face. You want to know what I regret most? It's not the hard years after his accident. Not the sleepless nights when I didn't know if he'd remember who I was in the morning. Not the frustration when he couldn't do simple things. Not the times when I felt so tired I wanted to just walk away from everything. I don't regret any of that struggle. Grace paused, and Michael could see tears forming in her eyes, though she didn't let them fall. What I regret, what haunts me, is every single moment I wished away. Every time I caught myself thinking about how much easier life would be if things were different. Every second I spent being angry about what we'd lost instead of being grateful for what we still had. Every day I didn't fully appreciate that he was right there, still breathing, still trying, still alive, still mine. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before continuing. You're lying in this bed thinking your life is over, thinking you've lost your future, thinking there's no point in fighting because you can't have the life you planned. But Michael, you still have a future. It's right there waiting for you just beyond this hospital room. It just looks different than what you expected, different than what you imagined. Grace leaned down again, and now her voice was fierce, urgent, almost desperate. Different doesn't mean not worth living. Different doesn't mean give up and wait to die. It means adapt. It means change. It means find new ways to exist in the world. It means discover parts of yourself you never knew existed because you never had to look for them when everything was easy. Michael felt something crack open inside his chest. His throat felt tight. But what if I try everything and nothing changes? What if I put in all that work and I still can't walk? Then you try anyway, Grace said simply, firmly. Because trying means you're still in the fight. Trying means you haven't given up on yourself. Giving up now means you've already lost everything before you even know what's possible. And I watched my husband fight for 20 years after his accident. 20 years of being different than he was before. 20 years of challenges and frustration and having to work hard for things that used to be effortless. And then he died suddenly. And I would give absolutely anything, everything I owned, to have just one more of those difficult days with him. Her voice cracked slightly with emotion. Just one more morning of helping him figure out where he put his wallet. One more evening of being patient when his brain wasn't cooperating. One more chance to tell him that I loved who he became, not just who he was before. One more day of struggling together, because struggling together was better than not having him at all. Grace straightened up and wiped her eyes quickly. You get to choose right now, Michael. You can give up today and spend however many years you have left wondering what might have been possible if you'd tried. Or you can fight even when it's incredibly hard. Even when it hurts, even when the progress is so slow you can barely see it happening. Because the alternative is giving up on yourself while you're still here. Still breathing, still able to make choices. She stepped back from the bed, composing herself. I'm not going to tell you what to decide. That's not my place, and I wouldn't do that even if I could. But I am